Hello everybody. So for today's video, what we're going to be looking at is the origins of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. Now this is an event that I consider to be in many ways one of the defining events of the post-war period. Um, if for no other reason because the Cold War lasts as long as it does. The Cold War, depending on who you ask, either starts in 1946 or 1945, and it lasts all the way up until 1991. So that's almost 50 years of history. And as such, that's something that's going to end up having a pretty big impact on American history and American society and America's global role, all of which undergo really quite significant changes as a result of the Cold War. Prior to the Cold War, the U.S. was a reluctant international player, eschewing permanent foreign alliances and also eschewing having a large permanent peacetime military. Both of those things are completely reversed after World War II as a result of the Cold War, with the United States spending increasingly massive sums of money to maintain military competitiveness with the Soviet Union. Something which, in and of itself, ends up having a massive impact on American politics. President Dwight Eisenhower would eventually come to refer to this massive impact that defense considerations and defense expenditures would have on shaping American society and really molding it as the military industrial complex. And so this is something that I think is very, very important. It's definitely something that a lot of people who have been born since the end of the Cold War really aren't that well versed in. So it is definitely something I think is worth talking, and not just because of the kind of the way that it changes America's global role in terms of turning the U.S. into um, this really kind of permanent, massive military presence in many parts of the world, but also in terms of domestic policy. The Cold War has all kinds of effects on American domestic policy, both for good and for ill. It is partly responsible for the massive wave of prosperity that Americans enjoy in the post World War II period, because of new government programs and expenditures that create new jobs in all kinds of industries related to the Cold War. It creates entirely new infrastructure for the country. The interstate highway system is a direct byproduct of the Cold War. Um, and it also creates opportunities for American businesses because of American efforts to revitalize the economies of Western Europe and Japan through the Marshall Plan. So there's some very positive economic aspects of it that help, again, fuel that post-war prosperity that so many people talk about when we talk about, kind of post-World War II America, that very widespread prosperity that John Kenneth Galbraith would come to refer to as the affluent society. The Cold War has a huge role in that. It also has a huge role in promoting the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement arguably would not have been able to get the kind of political leverage that it needed in many instances without the Cold War, which allowed civil rights leaders to, kind of paint a stark portrait of the, you know, juxtaposition of American equality and the promise of equality and democracy that the U.S. increasingly broadcasts around the world during the Cold War, with the reality of segregation. And so ultimately, the Cold War and fear of the Soviets, turning our civil rights discourse into propaganda, ends up boosting that movement in a way that it probably wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. So there are some good aspects of it, but there's also some pretty significant downsides to it. Um, it is the reason why we don't have a national health care program, unlike every other Western industrialized country. If there is one reason why you can point to say why doesn't the U.S. have a universal healthcare system, you'd have to start that discussion with the Cold War. And so that's a huge part of it. It also, you know, conversely, as well as helping the civil rights movement, it also sometimes proves to be a detriment, because people can try to accuse civil rights activists of being communist sympathizers and whatnot, and really that applies to a litany of other causes in the U.S. too. So amongst the downsides of the Cold War is this sort of creation of a culture of conformity, a suppression of dissent, and really kind of a erosion of the kind of progressive ethos that had characterized American development for the first 46 years of the 20th century. So that's another massive downside to it. So it's something that ends up having massive impacts on American society, again, both for good and for bad. But nonetheless, it is incredibly influential. And so it's important to understand how it emerged. And a good place to start is at the end of World War II. Actually, before the end of World War II. Basically, the fundamental thing that one has to recognize when we look at the Second World War, the war against Nazi Germany in particular, is that the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and the British in the Soviet Union, was never really a alliance in the true sense of mutual respect and admiration. There's always at the outset this sort of tacit acknowledgement by American and British leaders of what the Soviet Union is and who Joseph Stalin was. This is perhaps best captured by what Winston Churchill famously said when he heard that the Nazis had invaded the Soviet Union. If Hitler invaded the regions of hell, I'd at least give a passing favorable mention to the devil in the House of Commons. That's really quite damning with faint praise right there. And it illustrates the nature of the relationship. It's a marriage of convenience. It's an alliance of convenience. It's not one based on mutual admiration and mutual trust. In fact, the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, and more broadly between the Soviet Union and the West, was one characterized by mistrust. When the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government of Alexander Kerensky in the so-called October Revolution. It was actually in November, but anyway. When the Bolsheviks overthrew Alexander Kerensky in 1917, both the U.S. and Great Britain sent troops to Russia in 1918 to aid the anti-communist whites in the Russian Civil War. So there's this long history of mistrust. It really goes all the way back to the establishment of the Soviet Union. The U.S. didn't actually afford diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union until the mid-1930s. And so there's a long history of mistrust that actually predates World War II. But World War II really quite dramatically accelerates the growing difference between the two countries. And it's kind of mutual. The Soviets, on the one hand, grow increasingly suspicious of the United States and the British because of their delay in opening a second front. It is, of course, again worth mentioning that the Soviets lost over 20 million people in the Second World War, compared to the 400,000 that the United States lost, which by comparison seems like a drop in the bucket. And Joseph Stalin really became convinced that by mid-1943 that the U.S. and Great Britain were deliberately dragging their feet in opening up a second front to combat Nazi Germany and basically trying to deliberately bleed the Soviet Union white on the battlefield. So there's that as a source of distrust. There's also the fact that President Franklin Roosevelt didn't include include Stalin in on on developing the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project. The British were included in and kind of keyed in, kind of CC'd in, if you will, to the Manhattan Project from the very beginning. But the Soviets only learned of the Manhattan Project through espionage, which they conducted during the war in the United States. Um, so that was another thing that kind of sows the seed of mistrust, that the Americans and the British are plotting against the Soviets. But there's also plenty of things that the Soviets did that fueled mistrust as well. And that really goes back to the very beginning of the war, with the invasion of Poland. Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. The Soviet Union invaded the eastern half of Poland as per the Nazi, what's known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Non-Aggression Pact. Um, they invaded the eastern half of Poland on September the 17th. And while the Soviets were overriding the eastern part of Poland, overrunning the eastern part of Poland, they committed some pretty big atrocities, including the massacre of more than 20,000 Polish officers and government and intellectuals in the Katyn Forest, a atrocity that the Nazis um, uncovered and ultimately broadcast to the West in 1943 in an effort to sow disunion between the Allies. A ultimately effective effort, I might add. Um, the Katyn Forest massacre ultimately caused a break between the Soviet government and the Polish government in exile in London. And so from that point onward, there's this intense mistrust between the Soviets and the Polish government in exile. And that is only further intensified when the Poles launch a mass uprising in Warsaw in 1944, and the Soviets deliberately hold their tanks back on uh, on the other side of the Vistula River, um, basically letting the Germans wipe out the uprising. They deliberately withheld relieving the Polish resistance that had launched the Warsaw Uprising, and so they deliberately let them get slaughtered, basically. And so there's a lot of mistrust. And this all kind of comes to a head at Yalta in February of 1945. In February of 1945, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill meet at Yalta. It's the final meeting of the Big Three during World War II. And one of the big discussions that they have at Yalta is the future fate of Poland and other areas that had come under Soviet liberation during the war. And Stalin basically agrees. He agrees with Roosevelt's demand that in exchange for the Soviets being granted a sphere of influence and being allowed to station their troops in Eastern Europe, that they would allow free and fair elections in Poland and other areas of Eastern Europe under Soviet control. And so basically, the US and Great Britain are giving the Soviet Union a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe in exchange for this promise that they will allow democracy to take place, that they won't interfere with efforts to establish democracy. And they pretty much immediately break that promise. They pretty much immediately begin arresting those who support the government in exile, in some cases executing them. And they pretty much immediately begin putting in place the infrastructure for their own basically puppet state, communist government in Poland and in other areas that rapidly come under Soviet dominion. And so that failure to honor the promises made at Yalta really proves to be a major sticking point between the US and the Soviet Union, and it leads to really quite rapidly deteriorating relationships with the two countries by the time Nazi Germany is defeated in May of 1945. And this is only worsened by the change in leadership that occurs in 1945 as well, when Franklin Roosevelt dies on April 12th as a result of heart failure in Warm Springs, Georgia. He's replaced in office by Harry Truman, former Missouri Senator Harry Truman. And Truman, although he's a member of Roosevelt's same Democratic Party, he really embraces a very, very different political philosophy than Roosevelt had. Roosevelt is, this very he's a very he's a good deal maker. He's an expert deal maker. He's very good at finding that little bitty sliver of common ground that can bring people together who otherwise don't agree with one another. He's a consensus builder. And he's very good at finding those areas of common ground that can result in fruitful negotiation. And so he was very good at kind of dialing back Stalin's paranoia during World War II, and serving in many ways as sort of a go-between between Stalin and Churchill. And when Roosevelt dies, he's replaced by Truman, who's this guy who, again, although he shares some similar political principles to Roosevelt, is characterized mostly by this very direct, very blunt style of communication in politics. Famously, Truman had a sign on his desk in the Oval Office that said, "The buck stops here." And that sort of personal philosophy of full accountability, and basically non-bullshitting, was at the very core of his political philosophy. He was also, unlike Roosevelt, a staunch anti-communist. He had at one point during World War II actually proposed that the U.S. attack the Soviet Union. So he's not somebody who's very friendly to the Soviets. He's intensely anti-communist. He's very blunt. And so when Truman and Stalin meet for the first time at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945 to discuss the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan, it's very clear that there's a difference in philosophy and style, and really things kind of begin to go south from that point onward. And the atomic bombings of Japan really only intensify this. Again, there's considerable debate about what Truman's ultimate motive was in dropping the atomic bombs, but certainly the Soviets interpreted it in less than friendly terms. And so the use of atomic weapons against Japan would ultimately have a massive influence in shaping the Cold War. Now, by early 1946, the situation between the US and the Soviet Union has grown increasingly tense. The communications have broken down between Stalin and Truman. And again, it's important to recognize at this point that the US has essentially emerged as one of the two superpowers, one of the two polarities in world power at this point. The old great powers, Britain and France, they've either been largely discredited in the case of the French by being overrun by the Nazis, or in the case of the British, the fight was so desperate that they've essentially, they are no longer in a place where they can maintain their extensive colonies or their extensive, position in global leadership. And so basically, after 1945, the old great powers are either defeated, in the case of Nazi Germany and Japan, or they're countries like Britain and France that were once preeminent powers that rapidly are losing influence. And so the US really emerges as the only country capable, that's really intact enough to assume this mantle of international leadership in the West, which it does. And so 1946, you have that situation. And then you have the fact that the communication, again, between Stalin and Truman has really kind of broken down, with Soviet forces, really kind of trying to consolidate their power in Poland and Hungary and other parts of Eastern Europe. And there begins to be kind of this, for lack of a better way of putting it, war of words between the US and the Soviet Union. In February of 1946, Stalin gives a speech in which he directly compares the US and other Western capitalist societies to fascists, and, kind of saber rattles a little bit. And a month later, Truman invites Churchill to Missouri, to his home state, to here to Missouri, to give a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. And it's there that Churchill utters the phrase that would come to symbolize the division between East and West in Europe during the Cold War, the Iron Curtain, saying from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. And so that visual image of the Iron Curtain, of that stark division between Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe and the West, protected by the United States, really emerges as a major kind of feature at this point. And it leads to some pretty significant rethinking of American political and military strategies. Now, up to this point, the U.S. hadn't had any major real intention of maintaining a large standing military after the war ended. The post-war demobilization that typically occurred after a war for the United States was well underway by 1946. Millions of American soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines are returning home to the United States in early 1946. But the emergence of Soviet power in Eastern Europe and the aggressive manner in which that manifests itself, with the Soviets maintaining massive numbers of troops in Eastern Europe, more than double that of the United States and the Western Allies, ultimately leads to a stark reconsideration of American political priorities going forward. And so in 1946, it's really clear that, the U.S. is going to have to in some way stand up to the Soviet Union. And it's at this point that Truman really kind of has to search about for an answer. But that it doesn't take for very long for that answer to come to him. Ultimately, early in 1946, an American diplomat working in Russia, in Moscow, at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, George McKinnon, he sends this memo, this very lengthy memo, which for that reason comes to be known as the Long Telegram, in which he outlines a strategy for dealing with the Soviet Union. And to put things in the very simplest terms, basically, Kennan conceptualizes the Soviet Union as being akin to an insecure bully. That basically the Soviets, having been invaded twice in the 20th century, were chronically insecure. They were paranoid. That this was a deep-seated feature of the Russian psyche that had more to do with the fact that they've been invaded frequently historically than it did with any particular adherence to the communist ideology. And so he basically says, look, if these people step out of line, the only way that you're really going to be able to get them to listen to you is to respond accordingly with what he calls overwhelming counterforce. So basically, in Kennan's approximation of thinking of things, the way to deal with the Soviet Union is to try to contain their influence by basically standing up to a bully whenever they act aggressively. Now, when Kennan puts forward this proposal, which eventually becomes the basis of the U.S. containment strategy, he's thinking very specifically of the European context in Eastern Europe, and very specifically of the Soviet Union. And he's thinking of this in terms of strong but ultimately restrained responses to the Soviet Union. Eventually, many other thinkers will take Kinnon's basic idea and simplify it greatly, and really kind of transform it into this idea of really kind of containing this sort of pathogen, or contagion, this kind of virus, that many come to view communism as. And so over time, Kinnon's rather detailed analysis and ideas for dealing with the Soviet Union end up transforming into this very kind of bipolar worldview of, basically America good, Russia bad, basically, for the lack of a better way of putting it, or America good, communism bad. And that really was kind of an unintended consequences of it, but it's one that ends up having rather serious consequences. Now, Truman and others in his administration, most notably his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, they read the long telegram and they say, well, holy shit, this guy's got onto something. And so they decide to adopt many aspects of his proposal. And so Truman formalizes this the following year in 1947. And the context of how he formalizes this is over the situation in Eastern Europe, in Greece and Turkey. Basically, after World War II, much of Europe is devastated, naturally, because of 6 years of war. And the British, up to that point, had been providing military aid and assistance to the Greek government, which was, in fact, very authoritarian and fundamentally anti-democratic. But by 1947, the Greeks, who faced an internal insurgency, an insurgency that originated from nearby Yugoslavia, the British basically were unable to provide the Greeks with military or economic aid. They themselves were in need of economic aid themselves because of the devastation wrought by the Second World War. And so the British government reaches out to President Truman and says, look, we're not going to be able to help these people anymore. And the fear was basically, if Greece falls, then Turkey, which is where the Straits of the Dardanelles, leading from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, are located, that they might fall into the Soviet orbit as well, which of course would mean that the Soviets would have an entrance into the Mediterranean, which the Allies definitely didn't want. And so, because of the fact that the British were basically forced at this point to begin retreating from their global commitments, the British at this point rapidly begin shedding their overseas colonies, most notably in India, as do many other European colonial countries. The post-war period is also a rapid period of decolonization. The U.S. Basically Truman decides, well, the U.S. is going to step up. If the British can't do this, then the U.S. is going to take their place. And so basically what Truman does is he goes out and he is able to convince legislators, both Republicans and Democrats alike, of the need to combat the Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. And he gives a speech in which he outlines what comes to be known as the Truman Doctrine, which is essentially taking the basic containment theory that Kennan had proposed in the long telegram in 1946 and making it explicit American foreign policy, and by announcing military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey. And so with the announcement of the Truman Doctrine in 1947, the U.S. moves increasingly rapidly to developing a detailed six-pronged containment strategy that would develop organically over the course of the next 6 years. By the time President Dwight Eisenhower entered office, the U.S. would have adopted a six-pronged containment strategy for dealing with the Soviet Union. The first prong of this containment strategy was to exploit a massive advantage that the U.S. enjoyed, at that time a monopoly of, in 1947, nuclear weapons. When World War II ended, the U.S. is the world's only nuclear power. And so, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, up until the Soviets detonated their own nuclear weapon in 1949, U.S. containment strategy with nuclear weapons basically was an effort to balance the scales, if you will. As I mentioned previously, the Soviets had a much, much bigger army in Eastern Europe than the US did. They had about double as many divisions as the US and the British and Canadian forces did combined. But because of America's, at the time, nuclear monopoly, this was seen as something that would counterbalance that Soviet numerical advantage. And so initially, that was the role that nuclear weapons played for the United States as a deterrent, as a means of basically, mitigating the Soviet numerical advantage. Well, once the Soviets developed their own nuclear weapons in 1949, that very obviously is no longer a valid way of doing it. And so, essentially, what ends up developing after the Soviets developed their own weapon is the U.S. and the Soviet Union rapidly begin entering into an arms race with one another, developing not only ever more powerful nuclear weapons, but also ever more sophisticated means of delivering those nuclear weapons. Strategic bombers, eventually submarine-based ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the like. And basically by the mid 1950s, with the US and the Soviet Union each having their own nuclear arsenals, both the US and the Soviet Union essentially come to see nuclear weapons as a principal deterrent for military action. If you will, the threat of nuclear warfare is the thing that keeps the Cold War from turning hot. By 1954 or so, essentially this devolves into what comes to be known as mutually assured destruction. This idea that if any country launches a first strike on the other, that the other will respond in kind with a nuclear attack, and that this, of course, could end in complete devastation for both. And so that ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation is really at the very forefront of American containment policy for the duration of the Cold War. And so that's a very important component of it. Now, the second part of the U.S. containment strategy involves a massive expansion of American defense production. And this takes the form not only of increasing the size of the U.S. military on a permanent basis, with the U.S. having a large permanent military presence in many parts of the world from that point onward, in places like Germany and Japan and elsewhere. But it also takes the form of things like a civilian draft. In 1948, they enacted the first draft in peacetime, which continues all the way up until near the end of the Vietnam War, when for fairly obvious reasons, due to that war's unpopularity, it's ended. But it also takes the form of massive expansion of the defense infrastructure. By 1953, by the end of the Korean War, the U.S. is spending fully $2 out of every $3 on defense-related expenditures, for building more bombers, more tanks, more ships, etc. And so that becomes a massive part of it. Now, that massive increase in outlays for defense expenditures isn't just limited to things like building new barracks or tanks or planes or things like that. It also comes into the way that people think about how to defend the country. And one of the most visible remnants of this, or relics of this, is the interstate highway system. The interstate highway system, when it was first created in 1956, was envisaged principally as a defensive system designed to facilitate both the rapid evacuation of American cities in the event of a Soviet first strike, as well as a means of rapidly transporting American military resources to wherever they were needed. And that's reflected in the fact that the bill that actually creates the interstate highway system is known as the Interstate Highways and Defense System Act. So when I talk about a massive expansion of um, defense expenditures beyond nuclear weapons, I'm not just talking about, you know, guns and planes and tanks and ships and things like that. I'm also talking about things like the interstate system. Um, and this is illustrative of what President Dwight Eisenhower would later call the emergence of the military industrial complex in the United States by the end of his presidency in 1961, which was something that he, by that point, was increasingly alarmed at and concerned about, with the U.S. increasingly spending more and more of its money on defense-related expenditures than it did on social programs or really anything else. So that's a key component of it. Now that also ends up having massive economic effects for people because as factories expand to produce for the American defense industry, that creates thousands of new jobs. And certainly the Cold War and the expenditures that flow from it is definitely a big component of the post-war prosperity that many Americans do come to enjoy. Um, so that's definitely an important aspect of this. Obviously, another massive effect of the construction of the interstates is the expansion of suburbia that occurs after World War II. Now, there's other reasons why the suburbs expand, but the construction of the interstates really is a major catalyst for suburban expansion in the U.S. in the late 1950s and the 1960s. And so that's, I think, a very important component of that when we look at a kind of domestic aspect of this. Now, the third component of the U.S. containment strategy, so we talk about nuclear weapons, uh, conventional weapons. The third component of this uh, is the CIA, is intelligence. In 1947, the National Security Act is signed. And what the National Security Act of 1947 does is it does two things. The first thing it does is it reorganizes the command structure of the U.S. military, creating the Office of the National Security Advisor and creating the new department level Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The second thing that the National Security Act of 1947 does, and incidentally, it also creates the Air Force as its own separate branch. Um, the other thing that the National Security Act of 1947 does, is it creates the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, the successor to the World War II era Office of Strategic Services. And the CIA would increasingly play a critical, if often controversial, role in the Cold War. In many cases, the CIA would be involved not only in what we kind of think of as the traditional kind of cloak and dagger espionage of the Cold War, popularized by James Bond, but also in engaging in what would later be referred to euphemistically as regime change. And routinely throughout the Cold War, adopting this very kind of bipolar worldview that sees, basically the U.S. and democracy that sees the U.S. and capitalism as the good guys, and any kind of left-leaning ideology is fundamentally somehow linked to the Soviet Union. The U.S. will repeatedly in the Cold War, in the name of containing the spread of communism, oftentimes involve itself in the overthrow of democratically elected governments when those governments when it is worried that those governments are potentially either too leftward leaning or potentially moving in the direction of the Soviet orbit. And several of these instances have major ramifications for long-term American foreign policy, most notably in Iran in 1953, where the U.S. overthrows a democratically elected government under Mohammad Mossadegh and replaces it with an autocratic regime under the Shah that is itself eventually overthrown in the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which is the origin of the present-day animosity. between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. There's also coups in Guatemala in 1954, in Chile in 1973, and more recently, and perhaps most relevantly, the CIA's intervention in Afghanistan in the 1980s, which inadvertently created both the Taliban and Al Qaeda. So, good work. But anyway, so that's the third component. The fourth component of the containment strategy is economic aid. And this takes the form of most directly in the immediate post-war period, and one of the things that the U.S. ultimately comes to be most admired for, the efforts to rebuild the economy and society of Western Europe and Japan, known as the European Recovery Act, or as it's more commonly known, the Marshall Plan. Basically, the Marshall Plan came about as a result of the vision of former Army Chief of Staff turned Secretary of State George C. Marshall. Marshall, who had helped plan the American offensives in World War I, recognized that one of the things that had helped facilitate the rise of Adolf Hitler was the failure of the United States after World War I to rebuild post-World War I Europe. And there was very real fear in 1945 and 1946 that significant portions of Western Europe, most notably France and Italy, both of which had sizable armed communist groups in them, might fall into the communist orbit because of the wartime devastation and disarray that the war produced. And so ultimately, Marshall proposes this massive program of economic aid to basically rebuild from the ground up the economy of Europe, which the U.S. and its allies had essentially completely obliterated. And included in that plan is not just rebuilding the economies and societies of countries that were America's allies, like Britain and France, but also the countries that have been its adversaries, Italy, Germany, and Japan. And naturally, that component of it made it at the time somewhat controversial. But eventually it is approved. And eventually more than $16 billion, several $100 billion in today's money are spent in rebuilding the societies of Western Europe, providing them with food, medicine, rebuilding their factories and railroads and other things. And this ends up being something that the U.S. is both admired for. It's one of the reasons why after World War II, the U.S. was for a time the most admired nation on earth. But it also creates economic opportunities for the U.S. as well. New markets are opened as a result of the Marshall Plan. So this proves to be one of the components of America's Cold War strategy that is both genuinely humanistic and inspiring, but also, again, another component in helping create that post-war prosperity. The fifth component of the containment strategy involved creating military alliances, something which events in 1948 would demonstrate were manifestly necessary. And so this resulted in 1949 with the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. A permanent alliance between the U.S., Canada, Great Britain, and other nations of Western Europe to protect against Soviet attack. A key component of the NATO treaty stated explicitly that if any one member nation of NATO were to come under armed attack, that all the other nations of NATO were obliged to come to that country's defense. Interestingly enough, that particular provision has only been invoked once. Since 1949, and that was in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks, which is why you have a Dutch and Danish troop component in the NATO mission in Afghanistan, even though there really is otherwise not really much of a logical reason why they'd be there. But anyway, so that proves to be a very key component of building that new American-centered international order. That is part of the U.S. containment strategy. Finally, the final component of the U.S. containment strategy is a massive propaganda campaign designed to basically sell American society, American democracy, American capitalism, American culture to the rest of the world, particularly those nations that are rapidly declaring their independence from their former colonial masters, countries in Asia and Africa in particular. Um, the post-war period, as I mentioned previously, is a period of rapid decolonization throughout much of the world, and um, you have dozens of new countries that come into being in a very short period of time. By 1960, more than 3 dozen new countries have been created as a result of mass decolonization. And many of these countries were unaligned, not clearly aligned with either the United States or the Soviet Union. And that is actually the origin of the expression third world country. It's not a term that is necessarily meant to denote a country lacking in economic development, though in many cases that is also true. The term third world country is actually a Cold War term that refers to a country that is neither aligned with the United States and Western Europe and Japan, a first world country, or a country that is aligned with the Soviet Union and what comes to be known as the Warsaw Pact, a second world country. It's a third world country, so it's an unaligned state. Um, and that is where this ends up having, the Cold War ends up having rather significant domestic ramifications. The propaganda battle between the US and the Soviet Union ultimately centers on the language of freedom and equality. And the Soviets make great use of the fact that the United States at the time is in fact anything but equal when one looks at the way that African Americans are treated. And so ultimately, the Cold War efforts to, quote, win the hearts and minds of people in the third world, ultimately because of this, ends up becoming intricately linked with the cause of pursuing equality and ending segregation at home via the civil rights movement as well. So that's another example of how the Cold War ends up having a rather significant effect on domestic policy. And now, how all this is going to play out in real time in the real world, we'll discuss that in the next video.